History does not collapse into chaos. It collapses into recurring structural patterns. Great empires rarely crumble in a single dramatic moment. They quietly wear down, accumulating debt while celebrating prosperity, expanding military commitments while talking about security, centralizing power while promising efficiency, inflating their currencies while assuring stability. And when the structure finally cracks, the warning signs have often been visible for decades. From Spain to Great Britain and through the Soviet Union, the trajectory follows a disturbingly similar arc. Today, more and more analysts are looking at the United States and asking a question that would have seemed unthinkable 20 years ago. Has the world's greatest contemporary superpower quietly entered stage 5 of the historical cycle of superpower decline? The model of the 7 stages of imperial collapse is not mystical, not conspiratorial, and does not rely on prophecy. It emerges from economic history, political science, and the comparative analysis of empires. Civilizations are unique in culture, language, and context, but the structural stresses that strain them often rhyme. And the most dangerous part of all is that, when a society is in the midst of the process, almost no one believes it is. Stage 1. Explosive growth and strategic advantage. Every empire is born from a rupture, not by chance, but from a decisive advantage that shifts the balance of power. It could be a technological innovation, a productive revolution, an institutional reorganization, or a rare combination of all these factors. It is the moment a nation discovers a source of energy, literal, like coal or oil, financial, like precious metals or credit, or symbolic, like a mobilizing narrative, capable of projecting it far beyond its rivals. This stage does not begin with doubt. It begins with conviction. 15th and 16th century Spain did not merely dominate sea routes. It redefined the mental map of the world. Faster caravels, advances in cartography and navigation techniques allowed crossing oceans once considered impassable. When silver from the Americas began flowing into Seville, the Spanish Empire financed continental wars, consolidated dynastic alliances, and maintained an unprecedented global presence. Wealth seemed endless, power divinely ordained. For decades, there appeared to be no limits to territorial, military, or religious expansion. Great Britain experienced its rupture with the Industrial Revolution. Mastery of the steam engine, mechanization of textile production, the development of railroads, and a navy capable of controlling strategic choke points transformed a relatively small island into the central hub of global trade. London became the financial heart of the planet. The British Empire was not just a territory. It was a network connecting continents, raw materials, and consumer markets. The world began to revolve around its sea routes and banking system. The Soviet Union experienced explosive growth under a distinct but equally powerful logic. After the devastation of World War II, it mobilized resources with centralized discipline, prioritizing heavy industry, science, and military technology. In a few decades, it transformed from a backward agrarian economy into a rival of the world's greatest capitalist power. It launched satellites, developed a nuclear arsenal, and built an industrial machine symbolizing modernity and ideological strength. The United States consolidated its supremacy after 1945. Unlike European powers exhausted by 2 world wars, it emerged with intact infrastructure, colossal productive capacity, and a robust domestic market. Mass production, continuous technological innovation, leading universities, and the establishment of the dollar as the main international reserve currency created an unprecedented architecture of power. The Marshall Plan, strategic alliances, and control of major sea routes reinforced an international order shaped on its terms. In Stage 1, GDP growth is not just a statistic, it is a collective sensation. Populations expand, urbanization accelerates, productivity rises year after year, new industries emerge, jobs are created, social mobility seems natural, almost guaranteed. Young people believe they will live better than their parents. Investors see infinite horizons. The future is a promise. The currency strengthens, reflecting external confidence. Foreign capital flows in. Debt, when it exists, seems manageable because growth outpaces it. Innovation generates virtuous cycles. Technology drives productivity. Productivity increases income. Income stimulates consumption, and consumption encourages further innovation. But the most powerful element of this stage is not economic. It is psychological. A narrative of exceptionalism emerges. The belief that the country has not just grown, but discovered a permanent formula for prosperity. Superiority ceases to be circumstantial and becomes structural, almost inevitable. Institutions are celebrated as the most efficient in the world. The political model is considered exemplary. The economic system is treated as a universal standard. At this point, strategic advantage transforms into national identity. Success generates confidence. Confidence generates boldness. Boldness generates expansion. Expansion generates complexity. And complexity, when not managed prudently, plants the first seeds of excess. Explosive growth creates permanent expectations of continuous growth. Politicians begin promising more than the structure can sustain. International commitments multiply. Domestic programs expand. A high standard of living becomes an unquestioned norm. Adjustments become politically costly. At the height of Stage 1, almost no one speaks of limits. The talk is of leadership, destiny, historical mission. Prosperity is interpreted as proof of virtue. Strategic advantage as evidence of superior merit. Yet history suggests that no cycle of explosive growth is infinite. The initial energy driving the rise, be it silver, coal, central planning, or technological innovation, eventually meets constraints. Competitors learn. Technologies spread. Costs rise. Structures become heavier. The paradox of Stage 1 is that it contains both the origin of strength and the embryo of vulnerability. Expansion creates real wealth, but it also creates future obligations. Confidence generates cohesion, but can evolve into complacency. Strategic advantage differentiates, but also attracts rivalry. At the peak, however, none of this seems relevant. In Stage 1, everything seems possible. And it is precisely this sense of invincibility that makes the subsequent stages so difficult to recognize when they begin. Stage 2: financialization and wealth concentration. Over time, something subtle begins to happen within the great powers. The productive energy that fueled industrial growth, technological innovation, and commercial expansion starts to shift in form. It doesn't disappear, it transforms. The economy ceases to be predominantly based on the production of tangible goods and begins to revolve around capital management, financial engineering, and asset appreciation. Wealth no longer comes solely from manufacturing, building, or innovating, but from financing, intermediating, and leveraging. It is at this point that the financial sector begins to grow faster than the productive sector. Investment banks expand their influence. Derivative markets multiply contracts that few fully understand. Highly leveraged funds move volumes surpassing the GDP of many countries. And real estate speculation becomes a central engine of the economy. Credit becomes abundant. Consumption is sustained not only by income, but also by the promise of future asset appreciation. The feeling is one of continuous prosperity. Homes rise in value. Stock markets climb. Access to credit elevates living standards. Growth appears self-sustaining. This phenomenon was visible in 19th century London, when the financial heart of Great Britain became as powerful as its factories. The empire that once exported coal, steel, and textiles now exported capital. British investments financed railways in Latin America, infrastructure in Asia, and ventures across every continent. The City of London became a global nervous center. Decades later, the same pattern emerged with intensity on Wall Street in the United States. Complex financial instruments began moving trillions in seconds. Innovation was no longer only technological, it was financial. Derivatives, structured securities, debt securitization, And high-frequency algorithms created a parallel universe of abstract wealth, often disconnected from the real economy. The same occurred in various mature economies, where asset appreciation, stocks, real estate, bonds, came to represent an increasing share of GDP growth. Companies began prioritizing stock buybacks over productive expansion. Returns to shareholders became more important than long-term industrial growth. The logic of financial efficiency replaced the logic of productive capacity. At this stage, economic inequality begins to widen structurally. Wealth concentrates in financial assets, stocks, funds, business holdings, while real wages grow slowly or stagnate. Those who already own capital benefit from market appreciation. Those who rely solely on labor become dependent on credit to maintain their consumption standards. Social mobility, once vibrant during industrial expansion, slows. The top accumulates wealth through asset appreciation. The base sustains consumption through increasing debt. The system works until confidence is tested. Financialization creates apparent prosperity, but beneath the surface, systemic fragility increases. The greater the leverage, the higher the vulnerability. The more growth depends on continuous asset appreciation, the more sensitive it becomes to external shocks. Small ruptures can trigger amplified corrections. Bubbles become more frequent, and each bubble leaves a trail. Banking crises, unemployment, government intervention. Governments act as lenders of last resort, expanding balance sheets, cutting interest rates, injecting liquidity. Short-term stability is preserved, but at the cost of greater structural dependence. Gradually, a paradox sets in. The system appears more sophisticated than ever, yet also more vulnerable than it seems. The real economy begins to respond to financial market movements, not the other way around. Success ceases to depend solely on productivity and innovation, becoming contingent on maintaining confidence. And confidence is an invisible resource. It doesn't appear in quarterly reports, yet it underpins trillions in contracts. It isn't produced in factories, yet it keeps currencies strong and markets stable. When confidence is broad, the system seems solid. When it wavers, the speed of decline can surprise even the most optimistic. In stage 2, the empire still seems prosperous. Skyscrapers rise. Indexes reach new highs. The financial elite flourishes. But the structural base begins to shift. The economy's center of gravity moves from production to intermediation. It is precisely this silent shift that lays the groundwork for future tensions. Because concentrated wealth, leveraged growth, and credit dependence form a powerful and potentially unstable combination. Stage 3. Imperial overload. The power acquired in Stage 1 and refined in Stage 2 rarely remains static. It generates expectations. It creates commitments. It builds an international architecture that increasingly depends on the constant presence of that center of gravity. The empire ceases to be merely strong. It becomes indispensable. And it is at this point that overload begins to form, often invisible beneath the rhetoric of global responsibility. The dominant nation begins to see itself as the guarantor of international stability. It protects trade routes, intervenes in regional conflicts, funds strategic alliances, maintains military bases far from its home territory, and assumes the role of arbiter in disputes that did not originate within its borders. Power expands not only through ambition but also through systemic inertia. Allies request protection. Markets demand security. Treaties create automatic obligations. Spain experienced this dynamic intensely. Its ships crossed oceans laden with silver but also carried soldiers to endless wars in Europe. Defending scattered territories required constant funding. Each conflict spawned another. Each victory opened a new front of defense. The empire seemed vast, yet its capacity to sustain itself began to fracture under the weight of its own expansion. Great Britain perhaps built the most emblematic example of imperial overload. Its navy patrolled distant seas, ensuring trade flowed uninterrupted. Garrisons were spread from Asia to Africa, from the Middle East to the Americas. The cost of this presence was enormous, but as the industrial economy grew, it seemed justifiable. The problem arose when industrial rivals emerged and global wars drained resources accumulated over generations. The Soviet Union maintained ideological alliances, financed aligned governments, and engaged in indirect conflicts across multiple regions during the Cold War. Maintaining military parity with another superpower required colossal spending. The centralized economy could channel resources into the military sector, but did so at the expense of domestic consumption and productive efficiency. Structural tension grew behind the narrative of strategic strength. Today, the United States maintains hundreds of overseas military installations, participates in multilateral alliances, and occupies a central role in the global security architecture. Its logistical reach is unparalleled. Its power projection is rapid and technologically advanced. In the short term, this provides stability for allies and strategic influence for the country. In the long term, however, each commitment becomes a permanent obligation. Imperial overload does not arise from a single mistake. It emerges from the accumulation of rational decisions made over time. Each military base seems necessary. Each intervention seems justified. Each treaty appears to strengthen the international order. But when these commitments begin to outpace domestic productive capacity, imbalance sets in. The problem is not military strength itself. The problem is the accumulated cost over decades. When military spending outstrips the real economy's capacity, when public debt continuously finances foreign commitments, and when the population begins to question whether the strategic return justifies the fiscal sacrifice, tension ceases to be merely accounting. It becomes political. At first, the system absorbs the strain. Large economies can sustain prolonged deficits. Strong currencies allow cheap borrowing. Markets trust the stability of the power center. The population, benefiting from overall prosperity, rarely notices the incremental weight of external obligations. Then, the system tightens. Debt grows faster than GDP. The military budget competes with infrastructure, health, and education. Fiscal adjustments become politically difficult. Domestic debate polarizes between isolation and intervention. The confidence of creditors and allies comes to depend not only on military might but on domestic cohesion. Imperial overload also has a psychological dimension. When a nation becomes accustomed to leading, retreat appears synonymous with weakness. Reducing commitment sounds like an abdication of responsibility. The empire, therefore, maintains its presence even when the cost-benefit equation is no longer clear. This strategic inertia prolongs structural tension. There is also the technological factor. Maintaining modern military supremacy requires continuous investment in research, innovation, and equipment upgrades. The cost of staying at the top grows exponentially as rivals approach technologically. What was once a comfortable advantage becomes a constant race. Imperial overload rarely produces immediate collapse. It slowly erodes the system's flexibility. It reduces fiscal maneuvering space. It increases dependence on debt. It amplifies vulnerability to external shocks. An unexpected conflict, a global financial crisis, or a prolonged recession can act as catalysts in an already stressed system. Historically, when empires reach this stage, official rhetoric remains optimistic. Military strength is still impressive. Global presence is still visible. The flag still flies over multiple territories. Yet behind the projection of power, fiscal mathematics begins to tell a different story. Imperial overload is not just about excess bases or treaties. It is the moment when the center begins to sustain more than its internal structure can renew. It is when external commitments grow faster than domestic productive capacity. It is when hegemony relies on continuous financing rather than organic expansion. In stage 3, the empire still appears dominant. But structural tension is already in place. The system still functions, but now it requires increasing effort to maintain the same level of influence. And it is this gap between appearance and real sustainability that makes imperial overload one of the most critical signals in the cycle of superpower rise and decline. Stage 4. Monetary stress and currency fragility. Strong currencies are more than mere instruments of exchange. They are statements of power. They function as the invisible backbone of an empire. They facilitate international trade, reduce financing costs, attract foreign capital, and allow governments to issue debt with relative ease. A dominant currency is, in many ways, the quietest and most efficient form of power projection. But no currency is immune to time. No currency maintains hegemony indefinitely. In the cycle of imperial collapse, Stage 4 marks the moment when the monetary structure begins to show cracks, not through explosions, but through microfractures almost imperceptible to the eye. When Spain flooded Europe with American silver, it seemed to have discovered an endless source of wealth. Galleons loaded with precious metals arrived regularly, financing wars, palaces, and imperial ambitions. But the excess silver created structural inflation. Prices rose. Domestic competitiveness declined. Dependence on external wealth weakened the internal productive base. What appeared as abundance revealed itself as monetary distortion. The strong currency quietly eroded the real economy. Centuries later, Great Britain sustained the pound sterling as the anchor of global trade. London was the financial heart of the world. But 2 world wars drained reserves, required massive borrowing, and shifted the economic center of gravity. The pound did not collapse overnight. Its influence waned gradually as confidence migrated to another emerging power. Monetary hegemony simply changed hands. In the case of the Soviet Union, the ruble was never fully convertible on global markets. The lack of transparency masked structural weaknesses. The system maintained an appearance of internal stability, but its absence of real integration with the international financial system hid deep distortions. When economic stagnation became unavoidable, the currency reflected a reality that had long been administratively contained. Today, the United States dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency. It anchors energy contracts, settles international trade, and serves as a safe haven in times of crisis. In periods of uncertainty, the world still rushes to dollar-denominated assets. This is not trivial. It is a massive strategic advantage. But Stage 4 does not begin with the immediate loss of hegemony. It begins with growing dependence on it. U.S. public debt has surpassed historically high levels relative to GDP. In past decades, similar figures would have been considered alarming. Today, they have become part of the permanent landscape. In times of crisis, recessions, financial shocks, pandemics, the recurring response has been aggressive monetary expansion, low interest rates, asset purchase programs, massive liquidity injections. Each intervention prevented immediate collapse. Each also expanded the structural balance of the system. In the short term, it worked. Markets stabilized. Jobs were preserved. Financial institutions were supported. In the long term, inevitable questions arise. How far can expansion continue without compromising purchasing power? How much of current stability relies on the collective belief that the system will remain stable? Purchasing power does not disappear all at once. It erodes gradually. Small price increases become frequent. Housing, healthcare, and education costs rise above average. Inflation can be statistically managed, but the everyday perception of rising prices alters social mood. The currency continues to function, but now carries a subtle weight of distrust. This is the most dangerous aspect of Stage 4, its subtlety. There are no headlines announcing the end. Investors continue buying sovereign bonds. Central banks maintain reserves. Global trade flows continue. Yet the system's support increasingly depends on institutional credibility and political stability. Dominant currencies work because people believe they will continue to work. When that belief becomes an unquestioned premise, a paradox emerges. The greater the historical confidence, the greater the temptation to expand debt and liquidity beyond prudent limits. Another critical element is the relationship between currency and geopolitics. A reserve currency provides sanction power, the ability to isolate adversaries from the financial system, and an advantage in setting trade rules. However, frequent use of that power can encourage rivals to seek alternatives. Parallel payment systems, bilateral agreements in local currencies, and reserve diversification are discrete moves that individually seem insignificant, but collectively signal a search for redundancy. In Stage 4, monetary hegemony does not disappear. It begins to be questioned silently. International confidence depends not only on economic indicators, but also on internal political stability. If institutions appear fragile, if fiscal disputes become recurrent, if the debt ceiling becomes a tool of political conflict, the currency absorbs that tension. Because currency is, at its core, a promise that the issuer will remain stable, productive, and trustworthy. When confidence and currency become deeply intertwined, any institutional shock has amplified effects. Crises that would have once been local become systemic. Political fluctuations reverberate in global markets. Fiscal decisions are judged not only for their economic impact, but for their symbolism. Stage 4 does not announce imminent collapse. It signals heightened sensitivity. It is the moment when the system continues to function, but with narrower margins for error. When debt is still absorbed, but under increasing scrutiny. When the currency still dominates, but is no longer seen as absolutely unassailable. Historically, empires rarely recognize this stage while experiencing it. Residual prosperity masks emerging fragility. Positive indicators coexist with signs of structural strain. The system appears robust, until an external or internal shock accelerates dynamics already in motion. Because Stage 4 is not the end. It is the silent test of credibility. And when a currency begins to rely more on faith than fundamentals, the empire has already entered delicate territory. Stage 5. Institutional fragility and polarization. This is the most delicate turning point of the entire historical cycle. It is not the loudest moment. It is not the most dramatic. But it is the most dangerous. Because here, the system still functions. But it begins to function without trust. Institutions that for generations were seen as permanent pillars come to be openly questioned. The government is no longer perceived as a neutral arbiter, but as an instrument of faction. The press ceases to be seen as a mediator of facts and is accused of structural bias. The judiciary, once a symbol of stability, becomes a target of political suspicion. Large corporations, universities, and even regulatory agencies begin to be interpreted as ideological extensions. Political polarization intensifies not only in partisan terms, but in identity terms. Disagreement ceases to be about specific public policies and comes to involve incompatible worldviews. Debates are no longer just about taxes or budgets. They are about the true national identity. Which values should prevail? Which version of history should be taught? And who belongs, or does not belong, to the collective project? National narratives fragment. The minimal consensus, the one that allows political adversaries to recognize each other's legitimacy, begins to disappear. And when consensus vanishes, politics ceases to be regulated competition and becomes perpetual confrontation. Visible symptoms emerge gradually. Surveys show a consistent decline in trust in the government, parliament, the media, and major corporations. Elections become not just competitive, but contested in their legitimacy. Judicial proceedings are interpreted as political weapons. Public discourse radicalizes, with increasingly moralized and less pragmatic language. Bureaucracy grows, but efficiency declines. Regulations accumulate, processes become more complex, and perceptions of governmental inefficiency rise. At the same time, any attempt at simplification meets immediate resistance as each group fears losing influence. The result is legislative paralysis. Structural reforms, which require cross-cutting cooperation, become nearly impossible. In the United States, this pattern is the subject of intense academic and political debate. Indicators of institutional trust show continuous erosion over decades. Congress records historically low approval ratings. Trust in traditional media has sharply declined. Large corporations are simultaneously seen as engines of innovation and symbols of concentrated economic power. The information ecosystem accelerates this process. Digital networks create ideological bubbles where algorithms reinforce pre-existing beliefs. Information no longer circulates in a common public space. It is distributed in parallel universes. Each group believes it possesses its own version of reality, validated by its own experts and sources. Public debate becomes less about shared evidence and more about conflicting interpretations. This fragmentation has profound consequences. Modern democracies depend on diffuse trust, the belief that even when we disagree, we are playing by the same rules. When that belief weakens, every political decision is interpreted as an existential threat. Fiscal adjustments are seen as ideological attacks. Institutional reforms are perceived as attempts at capture. Compromises are denounced as betrayals. Governability becomes exponentially more difficult. Structural reforms require long-term cooperation. Public debt management requires consensus on shared sacrifices. Investments in infrastructure and education depend on planning beyond electoral cycles. When the political horizon shrinks to the next election, long-term policies lose priority. Another element frequently associated with Stage 5 is the so-called overproduction of elites. As advanced societies expand access to higher education, more highly qualified individuals are produced than leadership positions available. This competition intensifies internal conflicts. Frustrated ambitions seek political, media, or ideological channels. The result is increased rivalry within the ruling elite itself. Economic inequality also amplifies tensions. When wealth concentration becomes extreme, perceptions of injustice erode institutional legitimacy. Even if the economy grows in aggregate terms, the sense of relative stagnation fuels resentment. Trust that the system rewards merit diminishes. Stage 5, however, is not a sentence of inevitable collapse. It is a structural warning. It means cohesion is weakening but can still be restored. Institutions can be reformed. Narratives can be rebuilt. Political systems can adapt. History provides examples of successful institutional renewal when leadership manages to rebuild bridges before fractures become irreversible. The greatest danger is denial. Many empires, upon reaching this stage, continue to perceive themselves at their peak. Accumulated past growth creates a sense of security. Military and technological superiority fosters confidence that any problem is manageable. But institutional fragility is not solved by economic power or military force alone. It depends on shared legitimacy. When legitimacy weakens, the system may still appear stable on the surface. Markets function, elections occur, laws are passed, albeit slowly. But internally, the trust that sustains the institutional edifice begins to erode. And trust, once lost, is harder to rebuild than to destroy. It is at this stage that history becomes unpredictable, because the future ceases to depend solely on economic factors and comes to depend on collective choices. Stage 5 is the moment when a society consciously or unconsciously decides whether to reform or deepen divisions. It is the moment when everything still seems normal, but is no longer as it once was. Stage 6. Economic contraction and social fracture. When institutional fragility combines with monetary stress and structural overload, the economy ceases to function as a growth engine and instead operates as a system focused on damage control. Growth slows first subtly, then persistently. What were once natural cycles of recession and recovery become prolonged periods of stagnation. Dynamism disappears. Innovation loses momentum. Entrepreneurship wanes. Risk is avoided rather than embraced. Real wages stop keeping pace with the cost of living. Even when official numbers indicate growth, the population feels left behind. Housing prices rise faster than average incomes. Credit becomes more expensive. Inflation erodes purchasing power, particularly for middle and working-class households. What was once considered a standard of stability, owning a home, saving money, predictable retirement, becomes a restricted privilege. housing becomes a visible symbol of fracture. Young, skilled professionals work in modern sectors, master technology, and accumulate degrees, yet cannot afford property in major cities. The gap between wealth accumulated by previous generations and present realities generates silent resentment. The implicit promise of intergenerational progress begins to fail. The perception of social mobility, perhaps the most powerful element sustaining cohesion, weakens drastically. When a society believes effort no longer leads to advancement, trust in the system deteriorates. It's not just about income, it's about expectation. The sense that the future will be better than the present is replaced by persistent doubt. Highly skilled professionals begin to consider emigration. Brain drain does not occur all at once, but as a slow, continuous current. Doctors, engineers, scientists, and entrepreneurs seek more stable environments with greater regulatory predictability and clearer opportunities. Human capital, the most valuable asset of any advanced nation, begins to shift. At the same time, economic inequality becomes more visible. In earlier stages, wealth concentration could be masked by overall growth. In stage 6, with weak or negative growth, disparities become glaring. The perception of injustice amplifies social tensions. Public debate ceases to be merely ideological and becomes materially grounded. Protests become more frequent. Strikes, demonstrations, and waves of dissatisfaction are no longer isolated events. They become part of everyday political life. Social conflict can take multiple forms: labor movements, outrage against financial elites, revolts over price increases, challenges to tax or pension reforms. In all cases, the common denominator is the sense that the social contract has been broken. Historically, this stage has manifested in distinct ways. Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times over the centuries, unable to sustain its financial and military commitments. The initial abundance of precious metals was insufficient to offset structural imbalances and over-reliance on external resources. Great Britain, after 2 world wars, faced severe austerity, prolonged rationing, and industrial decline. Reconstruction required a redefinition of priorities and a drastic scaling back of imperial ambitions. Victorian prosperity gave way to the necessity of painful adjustment. The Soviet Union sank into chronic stagnation for decades before its ultimate collapse. The planned economy lost its capacity to innovate. Shortages became common. The gap between official narratives and everyday reality became unsustainable. The system did not collapse in a single day. It hollowed out from within. Stage 6 does not need to be abrupt. It can manifest as a decade of mediocre growth. It may seem like a succession of manageable crises. It can take the form of persistent inflation, rising debt, and postponed reforms. The danger lies precisely in this gradualness. Society adapts to slow decline. Expectations are adjusted downward. What was once unacceptable becomes normalized. Economic contraction combined with social fracture profoundly alters collective psychology. Political discourse becomes more radical. Simplistic solutions gain appeal. Trust in institutions, already weakened in the previous stage, takes another hit. If Stage 5 weakens institutional cohesion, Stage 6 tests the material resilience of the population. At this point, the system enters a critical zone. Either deep structural reforms restore dynamism through productive innovation, fiscal discipline, infrastructure investment, and social rebalancing, or the spiral of stagnation intensifies. History shows that Stage 6 is the moment when the cost of ignoring accumulated warning signs finally becomes concrete for the majority of the population. It is no longer an academic discussion about the decline of superpowers or imperial overreach. It is the daily experience of living in an economy that no longer grows as it once did, in a society where the promise of progress is no longer guaranteed. And when this perception becomes collective, transformation, in any direction, ceases to be a distant hypothesis and becomes an inevitable necessity. Stage 7. Restructuring or transformation. Collapse rarely means total annihilation. It is almost never the end of civilization, culture, or national identity. What collapses is the previous form of power organization. What dissolves is the architecture that sustained hegemony. What ends is the specific cycle of dominance. Stage 7 is not extinction. It is transformation under historical pressure. When structures built over centuries can no longer sustain their own internal tensions, the system enters a process of reconfiguration. There is no return to the past. There is no full restoration of the previous order. What emerges is something different, smaller, more decentralized, more rigid, or, in some cases, more resilient. Britain offers a classic example. At its peak, the British Empire ruled over a quarter of the planet. The sun never set on its territories. Yet 2 world wars drained resources, weakened its currency, and accelerated independence movements. The result was not the disappearance of the nation, but its reinvention. From a territorial empire, it became a strategic nation-state, a central member of military alliances, a diplomatic power, and a global financial hub. London remained relevant even without colonies. Territorial hegemony gave way to financial and institutional influence. Spain lost the political dominance it exercised in the 16th century, but its language, culture, and institutional legacy spread across entire continents. The loss of imperial power did not mean historical irrelevance. It meant a shift in position within the global hierarchy. The Soviet Union experienced perhaps the most abrupt transition. A highly centralized, nuclear-armed, and seemingly stable system dissolved in a matter of years. The political map was redrawn. New states emerged. The economy had to reinvent itself under extreme shock. What seemed solid proved fragile once internal legitimacy ran out. These cases reveal something fundamental about Stage 7. It has no single form. It can be gradual or sudden. It can be negotiated or conflictual. It can result in renewed stability or prolonged instability. Restructuring may take the form of a peaceful transition to a multipolar world, in which the former superpower remains relevant, but shares space with emerging rivals. It may take the form of authoritarian consolidation, when elites centralize power to prevent fragmentation. It can occur through deep democratic reform, aimed at restoring institutional legitimacy. It may involve economic reinvention, shifting the productive base and rebalancing fiscal policy. Or, in more extreme scenarios, it may result in territorial fragmentation. The central point is simple and unavoidable. The previous system does not return intact. The era of absolute supremacy is not restored. National psychology must adjust to the new reality. It is in this context that the contemporary debate about the United States gains intensity. The question is not whether disappearance will occur. That is highly unlikely. The question is whether restructuring will happen and to what magnitude. Structural indicators fuel this debate. High public debt relative to GDP raises concerns about long-term fiscal sustainability. Intense political polarization complicates structural reforms. The housing affordability crisis pressures social mobility. Aging infrastructure raises questions about future competitiveness. Information fragmentation undermines basic consensus. These elements are often cited as signs of institutional fragility, a typical feature of advanced stages in the decline cycle of superpowers. On the other hand, resilience factors are equally real. The United States continues to lead in artificial intelligence, biotechnology, energy, and military technology innovation. Its universities attract global talent. Its private sector remains highly dynamic. The dollar still functions as the main international reserve currency. The ability to attract skilled immigration provides a demographic advantage compared to aging powers. This duality makes Stage 7 especially complex. It is not a predetermined fate. It is a historical crossroads. History is not prophecy. It is structured probability. Patterns do not determine destinies, but they reveal accumulated vulnerabilities. They show that hegemonies do not vanish overnight. They transform when the cost of maintaining the previous model exceeds the system's adaptive capacity. Collapse, in the classical sense, rarely begins with tanks on the streets or markets closing permanently. It begins with normalcy, accompanied by rising tension, with debates that never resolve, with reforms postponed indefinitely, with prosperity that feels less secure than a generation ago, with institutional trust slowly eroding almost imperceptibly. Stage 7 is the moment when this tension demands redefinition. Society must choose between adaptation or rigidity, between reform or denial, between gradual adjustment or abrupt shock. The central question is not whether history repeats itself exactly. It never does. Each country has unique institutions, culture, and context. The question is whether power structures recognize patterns before they become irreversible. Because power almost always seems permanent while it is being exercised. It feels natural, inevitable, guaranteed. Only when it begins to redistribute does its fragility become apparent. No hegemony believes it is at an end while it still possesses military strength, financial influence, and technological capacity. Yet history shows that global transitions often occur not when power disappears completely, but when its margin of maneuver shrinks. Stage 7, therefore, is not merely a conclusion. It is a test of institutional maturity. It is the moment when a nation decides whether it will be a victim of its own tensions or the architect of its own reinvention. And this decision is rarely made in a single day. It forms over years of accumulated choices. In the end, power does not disappear. It transforms, shifts, or redistributes. The question is, who adapts fastest to the new reality? Because in the history of great powers, true collapse is not losing position. It is losing the ability to reinvent oneself.